Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement. And it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight or surrender. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? Well, Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side, he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better read than dead. Or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance.
We too often talk about trade while using the vocabulary of war. In war, for one side to win, the other must lose. But commerce is not warfare. Trade is an economic alliance that benefits both countries. There are no losers, only winners, and trade helps strengthen the free world. Yet today, protectionism is being used by some American politicians as a cheap form of nationalism, a fig leaf for those unwilling to maintain America's military strength and who lack the resolve to stand up to real enemies, countries that would use violence against us or our allies. Our peaceful trading partners are not our enemies. They are our allies. We should beware of the demagogues who are ready to declare a trade war against our friends, weakening our economy, our national security, and the entire free world, all while cynically waving the American flag.
Check. All right. Yep, there it is. Sorry, something got turned down in my software over here. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Lucille. Glad to see you both. Sorry to have started off on a bad foot here. I didn't notice that the volume got turned down in the software. That's how things go sometimes. So that's going to make for an interesting intro to the video then, where Ronald Reagan says some wonderful things, and then I apparently talk to the camera for a little bit. So let's go ahead and continue on, just to summarize what I was talking about here. I am a believer in America. I'm a believer in the promise of America. And I believe that as long as we in the United States follow God's laws and remain righteous, that we will be blessed beyond measure for the rest of time. But we're seeing signs that we are setting aside our righteousness, our moral high ground, and selling our souls for a mess of pottage to the father of lies, Satan himself. And this is the concern I have about the direction the United States is going. So we will see if that plays out or not. To a certain extent, this is me putting my moral stake in the ground and stating my desire for the U.S. to remain a city on a hill, a shining beacon of freedom and justice. But let's continue on. From Donald Tusk here, who stated as he was departing for a London summit, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a paradox. 500 million Europeans are asking 300 million Americans to protect them from 140 million Russians. The solution is simple. If we need to count anything, it should be counting on ourselves. Europe is a global power." And I've run the numbers on this before. I've mentioned it many times. Europe's GDP by itself dwarfs that of the Russian Federation. They have far more people. Now, they're not nearly as united as far as their government is concerned. I'm not going to make one call or the other as to what Europe should do as far as their government goes. But I can tell you this. They have the resources and the capability. The question, much like that of America, is do they have the political will to stand up for themselves? Or are they going to fall down on their knees and surrender? And I would say that they should not. Because down that path lies sorrow, misery, and death. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the big news from this past week. It's been 2 weeks since my last live stream, and a lot has happened since then. Now, initially I was going to just play this video from a Dutch public broadcaster that was a sketch based on what was going on here. And long story short here, we have these two paramedics responding to a situation where a man hit this other man, and then they're like, wait a minute. Did he say thank you now that we're here to help him? Oh, come on. And then it goes downhill from there. So let's go ahead and talk about the situation with Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office. They had a press conference in the Oval Office. It was about 40 or 50 minutes long. Some things were said. And Zelensky, when J.D. Vance, by the way, it's unusual to have J.D. Vance in the middle of this type of a leadership deal. And I have theories on that, but they're not important right now. But J.D. Vance was there, and he's saying, yes, well, we're going to get, and I'm just summarizing in the broadest of terms here, basically saying we're going to get Putin to sign on to a peace agreement and hold him to it. And Zelensky says, wait a minute, hold on. You do realize that we've tried this many times. We've already made multiple peace agreements, and he's broken every single one. How are you going to make him sign these peace agreements and stick to them? And Vance goes off on him on what to me sounds like he had rehearsed what he was going to say to try and destroy Zelensky there in the Oval Office. Now, others are going to say, well, obviously Zelensky was rude, impolite, and I could probably grant you some of that. That does not give J.D. Vance the right to start screaming his head off at Zelensky and telling effectively lies about the situation. The fact is that J.D. Vance had his rehearsed talking points. Zelensky called him out on it, and he didn't like it. And then Donald Trump felt that he had to jump in there and stop the whole thing, and then chew out Zelensky for coming into his house and having the temerity to speak the truth. So that's the long story short. Now, I have got a certain spin on that I have expressed. I do believe in this case that Zelensky could have potentially been a better statesman in this. There's a lot of things to criticize there, but the criticism of his outfit is the stupidest of them. It's literally style over substance. The criticism of him bringing it up, I can absolutely see that. There could have been better ways to express this, or better times. That said, that does not excuse Zelensky. It does not excuse Trump, who took what could have been just a few moments of, we've got to, we have Vance saying, hey, we have worked on a particular relationship. We'll work on those security guarantees at a later date. Zelensky could have said, I disagree with your analysis there, but I will discuss this after the meeting here. There's a lot of places where this particular road could have been taken as an off-ramp. The fact that there was no off-ramp taken is a statement about all the personalities involved and the pressures of the situation they're in. But anyway, so we have the reaction of American volunteers in Ukraine who voted for Trump. And they are calling out the things that Trump has been saying. He says, how long is this? I don't remember now. It's 3 minutes, too long. He says that there's a lack, that Trump said there was a lack of people to fight, and he says, no, there's not. There are people from 58 countries here, thousands of people gathering from all over the world, in addition to hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian fighters who are fighting now. Trump is painting a really bad picture that reinforces the arrogance of Russians. This is, in essence, Russian propaganda from the mouth of the American president. I'm going to go ahead and put this link in here so you guys can check it out at your leisure. But that is the long story short here. Everybody is talking up Russia's war-fighting capabilities. What they're not talking about is the fact that Russia doesn't have the economic wherewithal to actually sustain all-out war with anything but bodies. And there's a lot to be said about quantities of bodies. But what isn't to be said is that there is some kind of amazing Russian warfighting machine backing them up. That's simple. A former, I believe, former senior policy advisor to Putin, and now a senior fellow for the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., gave his analysis of it. But he mentioned that he learned about Trump's decision, which I haven't mentioned yet. But the Trump administration made the decision to cut off all military support to Ukraine on February 25th, 3 days before the Zelensky White House meeting. And they are now blaming that retroactively on Zelensky. Unfortunately, this has the ring of truth to me. It means that before this whole dust up in the Oval Office ever happened, they already had the plan in place to cut off this support, and we're already making progress in that in order to put pressure on Ukraine, not on Russia, not on the aggressor. And the reason is because the truth is the U.S. has no particular cards over Russia. The U.S. has already played their hand on Russia. So therefore, they have to put pressure on the person they can put pressure on, and that is Ukraine and Zelensky, in hopes of creating a situation where he can force Zelensky to capitulate, to give up in the face of this. And the problem is that now it's looking like the U.S. has played all their cards there. They've now cut off support. They've cut off intelligence sharing with Ukraine. What more cards do they have? Short of literally bringing U.S. military hardware in. Oh, by the way, they've also cut off some of the weapon systems, the ability to use them, or at least to accurately target them. So this is an interesting look for the rest of the world, who had been relying on or expecting U.S. hardware to fill in the gaps in their defense capabilities. But anyway, the clear message here is only that now that Trump has played the U.S. cards against Russia, he's now trying to play the U.S. cards against Ukraine, and he's finding himself with no cards to play anymore. Europe's already picking up the slack, and we'll talk about that as we go. Continuing on. As Truth Matters states, now this is a political organization here that talks about some of the issues around here, and they are definitely negative about Trump. But they mentioned specifically, last night, bombers took off, drones were launched, and missiles were fired from Russia. Ukrainian air defenses knew they were coming but had no idea what their targets were because the President of the United States prohibited vital intelligence to be shared with battlefield commanders. Now, they talk about the results of that and the complicity of the United States in there. But long story short here, Vance has now stated that the only U.S. security guarantee in Ukraine will be the mineral deal. There will be no other. And that just means that there'd be U.S. companies on the ground. But U.S. companies worked in Russia before. Trump has no problems with U.S. companies working under Russian governments. He never has. So having U.S. companies in Ukraine dealing with these minerals, they don't care whose flag is over the top of the facility. All they care about is that they're getting their money out of it. So now Vance is saying that this mineral deal is the only security guarantee that Ukraine's going to get, and that's just not going to cut the mustard. As I mentioned, Donald Trump has paused all military aid to Ukraine to turn up the heat on Zelensky. Now, the former president of Poland did write this letter to Donald Trump, and I had to confirm this a couple of times to make sure it was actually a real letter, but it's accurate. Let's see. I can read this. I'll be reading this pretty quick here. Your Excellency, Mr. President, we watched your conversation with President Zelensky with fear and distaste. It is insulting that you expect Ukraine to show gratitude for U.S. material aid in its fight against Russia. Gratitude is owed to the heroic Ukrainian soldiers who have been shedding their blood for over 11 years to defend the free world's values and their homeland attacked by Putin's Russia. How can the leader of a country symbolizing the free world fail to recognize this? The Oval Office atmosphere during your conversation reminded us of interrogations by the security services and communist courts. Back then, prosecutors told us they held all the power, while we had none. They stripped us of our freedoms for refusing to cooperate or express gratitude for our oppression. We are shocked that President Zelensky was treated in a similar manner. History shows that when the U.S. distanced itself from democratic values and its European allies, it ultimately endangered itself. Wilson understood this in 1917 when the U.S. joined World War I. Roosevelt knew it after Pearl Harbor in 1941, realizing that defending America meant fighting in both the Pacific and Europe. Without President Reagan's and U.S. financial support, the Soviet Empire's collapse would not have been possible. Reagan called the USSR an empire of evil and confronted it decisively. We won, and today his statue stands in Warsaw, facing the U.S. Embassy. Mr. President, military and financial aid cannot be equated with the blood shed for Ukraine's independence and freedom of Europe and the world. Human life is priceless. Gratitude is due to those who sacrifice their blood and freedom, something self-evident to us, former political prisoners of the communist regime under Soviet Russia. We urge the U.S. to uphold the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which established a direct obligation to defend Ukraine's borders in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons. These guarantees are unconditional. Nowhere do they suggest such aid is a mere economic transaction. Signed, and I can't pronounce that, so there you go. There is a lot of consternation about what's going on in the U.S. right now, and it's causing a lot of other issues. Igor Strelkov, who's imprisoned in Russia, continues to write and give his analysis of these events. He claims he thinks that Trump is stringing Putin along in an attempt to secure any deal that would push Russia out of the game. If the negotiations fail, the U.S. will further strengthen Ukraine for another offensive. Moscow is likely aware of this and will try to delay talks for as long as possible, making escalation all but inevitable, according to him, which is one of the possible interpretations. I don't see it, but you know what? I am merely a purveyor of the news, not an analysis thereof, an analyst thereof in that same sense. He sees things from a Russian perspective that I will never be able to see. So maybe all of this is a ruse. Maybe it's not. 40 U.S. lawmakers urged Trump to stop supporting Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. The best way to end the war in Ukraine is to support Ukraine with arms, not give aid and comfort to Russia, its puppets and client states and dictators around the world. I go back to Ronald Reagan once again, who called for peace through strength. That does not mean making our enemies stronger. This is the video of them talking about this. I'll just drop the link here. I've got so much to cover. I would love to be able to sit here and play each and every one of these, but it's how it goes. Now, the minerals agreement. Originally, it was a pretty bad deal for Ukraine. It was basically fork over $500 billion that the U.S. will control outright. The latest minerals agreement is basically just an agreement to agree. And this, they've also gotten in there, the purpose of the agreement is to achieve a lasting peace in Ukraine. The agreement is really only an agreement to negotiate, containing no specifically enforceable concrete promises, and kicks the can down the road. It lists as an integral element of the overall deal architecture American support for Ukrainian security guarantees. And therefore, I can see why perhaps Trump might be trying to end it. He doesn't see where the U.S. gets money for nothing in that one. But this is just an opinion on that one. The Zelensky says he hoped that this initial mineral deal will lead to further deals with the U.S. They called it more of a framework. They were creating a jointly owned fund. Originally, the fund would have been held by the U.S. exclusively of Ukraine's natural resource revenues, which would be contributed, but as it is too early to talk about money, I wanted to have a sentence on security guarantees for Ukraine and its importance in there. And basically, that's the long story short on that. Now, Ukrainians, some of the Ukrainians, and I'm just going to say some because there are many Ukrainians of various opinions, but some Ukrainians are saying that as much as this is a negative for Ukraine, there is a positive side. Europe has woken up, finally, and Ukrainians are more united. And we'll talk about that. I've got some numbers for you in a bit on that. As part of the stop on intelligence sharing, Maxar Satellite Company has closed their access to their satellite images following a, quote, request from the U.S. administration. This says there's been no official confirmation, but I've seen it from about 5 different sources now, all referencing different parts of it. So there's that piece of information. France and the UK, however, are stating that they will continue to provide intelligence to Ukraine to fill the gap left by the U.S. We have intelligence resources that we use to help the Ukrainians, according to a French radio station there. Then Kellogg, who's been actually pretty vocal on his support for Ukraine, goes on to a talk show and says, Trump promised to end the war in 24 hours, but we didn't say which day exactly. I'm sure that was meant to be a joke, but it did not come through. I should just say it did not come through well. It didn't land. Bloomberg says that the United States is demanding that Ukraine agree to a quick ceasefire as a condition for signing a mineral agreement, which is a new condition put on top of the whole thing. Yeah, well, we'll see how that goes. You know, it'd be nice if they would pressure Russia for once. President Zelensky, though, for his part, released this statement. I would like to reiterate Ukraine's commitment to peace. None of us wants an endless war. Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. We are ready to work fast to end the war, and the first stages could be the release of prisoners and truce in the sky, ban on missiles, long-range drones, bombs on energy and other civilian infrastructure, and truce in the sea immediately, if Russia will do the same. Then we want to move very fast through all next stages and work with the U.S. to agree a strong final deal. We do really value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. And we remember the moment when things changed when President Trump provided Ukraine with javelins. We are grateful for this. Our meeting in Washington at the White House on Friday did not go the way it was supposed to be. It is regrettable that it happened this way. It is time to make things right. We would like future cooperation and communication to be constructive. Regarding the agreements on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it at any time and in any convenient format. We see this agreement as a step toward greater security and solid security guarantees, and I truly hope it will work effectively. Still, the Trump administration has pretty much decided they want to sideline Zelensky if they can in any way or possible. They have begun meeting with opposition groups in Ukraine. Now, journalist J.P. Lidsley, who's in Ukraine, a U.S. journalist in Ukraine, has stated, "Isn't this exactly what Trump has been accusing the Americans of doing back in 2014, meddling in other nations?" So, of course, they talk about Nuland for a bit there, but I'm going to move on from here. There's a great thread about the whole Nuland bit there. So if you have somebody who's like, well, Nuland is the one who arranged the overthrow of Ukraine's government, the people who were on the ground at the time have a very vastly different perspective on that. So I'm just going to drop this thread in there, which I do not have time to go through today. The former president, Poroshenko, I think is what his name was. Yeah, Petro Poroshenko, stated that half the country couldn't sleep last night. This is the day after the press conference. After watching the videos from Washington, we are all holding our breath for Ukraine. Everyone's asking what comes next. Some expected me to criticize Zelensky, but no, there will be no criticism, because that's not what the country needs right now. Putin, however, is demanding that Ukraine should hold a presidential election in wartime. This is very similar to a previous era, shall we say. Nazi Germany demanded that Britain hold a presidential election, or an election, in July of 1942. And there's the story of how they prolonged things and the situation there is right here. So for those who are saying, well, there's no precedent for not holding elections during wartime, there you go. Your precedent right there. Do appreciate that Chris put together this thread for us. It's a great resource for everybody. Zelensky, though, for his part, stood up and said, I am ready to exchange my resignation for Ukraine's NATO membership. If it is absolutely necessary for me to leave my post, he said, I am ready to do so. I can exchange it for NATO membership. If such conditions exist, then immediately, without prolonged discussions. I am focused on Ukraine's security today and do not intend to remain in power for decades, like Vladimir Putin. That's an aside by me. This is probably my dream. Can you imagine? He's saying, I would happily step down if we get into NATO so we'd have the protection that my beloved country needs. Now, Tyndar had another perspective on the whole meeting with Ukrainian opposition figures. Reading this and then realizing that those opponents are Tymoshenko and Poroshenko tells me how politically illiterate those Trump officials are. Those two Ukrainian politicians not only repeatedly said that they stand by President Zelensky in the matter that there shouldn't be any elections during the war, with the Ukrainian constitution forbidding it, those two are not even the strongest challengers when it comes to Zelensky, because this would be Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's former commander-in-chief and now Ukraine's ambassador to the UK. And even Zaluzhny makes it clear that he will stand by Zelensky for the remainder of the war. Considering that he has an even more hawkish stance on Russia than Zelensky, completes that picture. What the Trump administration is doing is therefore not only another interference into domestic politics of an ally, but actually quite stupid. It would lead nowhere near to what Trump or his acolytes might think it does. And that's not to say Zelensky is the most popular figure, but we'll go into. I've got some numbers on that in a bit here. In the meantime, let's talk about Russian disinformation. And this one I definitely want to play. This is a Russian who fled to the U.S., who recorded a video for Americans talking about Trump's lies about Ukraine. He likely fears the U.S. will turn into a dictator's prison, just like Russia. That's Victoria's editorial note there. So here's Mr. His name just escaped me. It's in here. You'll see.
My name is Sergey. I'm Russian and I stand with Ukraine. I'm ashamed of what my home country is doing right now. I'm also shocked by what political establishment in the United States is saying about Ukraine, about Zelensky, because it's not true. It was Russia, my home country, who invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. Zelensky is a democratically elected president of Ukraine who won in fair elections. And Putin is a dictator who has been ruling my home country for 25 years. I want to say to Ukrainian people that I will support you. I will stand with Ukraine. My name is Sergey. I'm Russian
and that's Sergey's commentary for the U.S. and for Ukraine. A lot to be said for putting himself on camera that way and putting it out there. In the coming weeks, a massive information attack against Ukraine will emerge from the U.S. We will hear claims that Ukraine is an artificial country, a creation of Austria and USAID, a dictatorship ruled by Nazis, and that it illegally produces weapons of mass destruction. The narrative will push that Ukraine is inhabited by Russians who want to go back and that Biden is to blame for everything. The goal? To weaken support for Ukraine and pave the way for Trump's peace plan. The next few weeks will be tough. It will feel like America has betrayed Ukraine, Europe remains asleep, and Russia is winning the information war, but that is all part of the strategy. Trump wants to end the war immediately, but Putin isn't negotiating. He wants Ukraine's full capitulation, demilitarization, denazification, and the return of Russian agents. The U.S. won't pressure Russia. It sees that as escalation. Instead, Ukraine will be the target. Why? Ukraine prevents Europe from becoming defenseless. Ukraine blocks Russia from being strengthened and used against China. In this game, Ukraine is an obstacle that must be punished. The only thing we can do is hold firm. Surrender means the loss of our families, friends, and possibly ourselves. Some still don't believe in another Bucha or Mariupol happening everywhere. But history has already shown us what Russia does. Concessions won't bring more aid. Trump doesn't want to prolong the war. He wants it over immediately. No amount of gratitude or apologies will change that. If you can, then he talks about avoiding spreading this disinformation. Time moves fast. If we endure, we move forward, and we are not alone. There are many forces in the world that do not want Ukraine to be defeated. Most importantly, we ourselves. Stay strong, stay informed, resist. So this is from Roman Sharamita, a professor of economics and a board member, founding rector of American University in Kyiv. There's a lot to be said about what he put down there. There's disinformation, and it's going to be a massive campaign. And I can tell you, it's already working because I'm seeing it in multiple places. And the problem is that those who have good information are going to rapidly get exhausted by trying to correct all of the disinformation that will be coming out. How Russia wins from Jason J. Smart. Russia understands something fundamental. Normal people in Ukraine, the US, and the EU will never become Putin's fanboys. Across the developed world, Putin is broadly recognized negatively as a dictator and as a terrorist. But did you know that Russia makes no serious effort to change this perception in the West? Rather, Russian propaganda is more sophisticated. It convinces people to unknowingly support Russian interests without mentioning Russia itself. It convinces individuals they're serving their own interests. Consider polling questions. What's the biggest problem facing the country versus what's the biggest problem facing you and your family? The latter always holds more weight for any pollster's analysis. Russia leverages this insight. Rather than arguing abstract geopolitical alliances, Russia subtly asks, "You're aging without adequate retirement savings. Why spend billions abroad when you need help here at home? Your economic debt is climbing and your government chooses Ukraine over you. Why let this happen? You have not saved enough for college. Your son might go to the army instead. Do you want him in a nuclear World War III?" People aren't inherently aligning with the Kremlin. They're simply prioritizing their immediate concerns over distant abstractions. They worry about real, tangible problems affecting their daily lives and futures. The vast majority of the MAGA bloc isn't inherently pro-Russia or indifferent to European security. They're Americans feeling left behind, frustrated by governments that appear to prioritize external issues above their well-being. And there's some great additional paragraphs there, but I think that's a good flavor of what he was talking about. This is how Russian propaganda works. They can't market Russia as the best, as being the best thing ever, at least not to an American audience. But they can certainly exacerbate the weak points that they see. An unresponsive federal government, a bad response to various disasters, the poor quality of many of the government services we have. And they can put their pressure there and say, focus on yourself, not on what the world is doing. Isolation by disinformation. So Ukraine, let's talk about Ukraine for a few moments here. Poll from Reuters of the what Americans think of Trump's Ukraine rhetoric. The purple side is the disagree, and the orange side is the agree. Ukraine is more to blame for starting the war. All adults would be 70% disagreeing with that, meaning that Russia started it. Republicans even 62%, same, and Democrats 81% with an average of 70. And the U.S. should get a share of Ukraine's minerals. 50%, basically half of the nation thinks that's the case. This is an interesting snapshot in time of the U.S. mindset here, where their support for Ukraine, I would say, is going from a moral high ground position to a tangible benefits high ground, one where the economics mean more to them than defending freedom. Interesting to see. However, after the dust up in the Oval Office, Zelensky's approval rose. I think it was around 57. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, 57% before, and it rose to 67% after. Sorry about that. So maybe the average Ukrainian at least is standing up with their president in the sense of facing down those challenges to the truth. Maybe not. Could be a temporary bump. I don't know. It looks like he's been pretty popular overall, but not necessarily the best of polling numbers. Better than most, I'll just put it this way, better than Congress. Now, I stopped providing these videos because, number one, there was so much else going on. But with the dust up in the Oval Office, including, why aren't you more thankful? Why didn't you said thank you? I used to share these all the time early on. And, well, I stopped doing it because there were more important things to talk about. They never stopped coming. They were always there. But here are Ukrainians expressing support for specific U.S. designed and built systems. Another one from Patriot Launcher Crew, saying they are thankful for their support. I wish I had the time to just play all of them. But Ukraine has been saying thank you all along. And just because you're not paying attention doesn't mean that the word isn't there. Ukraine is working on obtaining alternative sources of intelligence, and if necessary, they'll even ask Germany for anything they can get. So they're working on getting a replacement for U.S. influence, for lack of a better way to say it. Now, some people have said, what has NATO ever done for us when they're just costing us tons and tons of money? Did you know Article 5, NATO's Article 5, calling on mutual defense, has been invoked exactly one time? Singular. Right after 9/11. The U.S. invoked it. Ukraine sent 5,000 troops to Iraq, with 18 of their soldiers dying in the defense of U.S.'s call for that assistance. So when the U.S. says help, there are nations there for it. In fact, I've got a whole list somewhere in this, I think, showing all of the nations that responded and had their own men die in service of the U.S.'s foreign interest. So now we're still talking about getting out of NATO. There's various opinions on that. But at least be fully informed before you make that decision. More words of gratitude. I managed to get this out of order here from another Hawk SAM system operator. And again, lots of things there. Ukraine wasn't officially asked by the U.S. to make territorial concession. We have not received such proposals, a foreign ministry spokesperson said, downplaying certain formulations that can be heard in the media. But this is at least it's an interesting statement. This is trying to mend some fences here and build some bridges. We'll see how that comes out. Maybe too little, too late. There may be the end of U.S. assistance to Ukraine. I don't know. I just don't know. Now let's move over to Russia, where Russian officials and Kremlin officials have explicitly rejected making any concessions in future peace negotiations or accepting any U.S., European, or Ukrainian peace proposals. The only peace proposal that Russia has is basically the full surrender of Ukraine, where Russia gets to keep everything they've taken. They get even more territory that they've never touched but want. And then Ukraine has to demilitarize and not be able to defend itself in the future. This is basically they're just taking the mask off here. They're saying there's absolutely nothing that they will accept other than what they state. From Vladimir Putin, we do not need anything that is foreign, but we will not give up what is ours. And we need such an option that would ensure the stable development of our country in peace and security. Of course, that's followed by the Russian propagandists saying, look, let me just back this up a second because it starts right at the beginning. Let me mute this here. Only the inevitability of the destruction of the United States of America will give us the peace that we have been talking about today. That is the peace that Vladimir Putin wants. And don't forget, they think, Alaska is theirs. They've been talking about that lately, too. From Ben Shapiro, sharing a post from Karim Rifai. Today, this is several days ago now, a famous three-time Russian Olympic wrestling champion turned politician, Buvaysar Saitev, wow, sorry for butchering that one, has died after allegedly falling from his third-floor Moscow apartment window. This is what opposition politicians get in Moscow, especially when they're being effective. Although on the other end of the stick, we've got a nice toasty fire happening at the Stary-Oskil railway station in Belgorod region. So still partisans at work in Russia. Let's move over to the international front. And as I do, I would absolutely encourage you guys to pipe up, say something, ask questions. Thank you very much. I'm so glad the chat is working today. So absolutely pipe in and let me know what you're thinking. Moving to the international front, and this is, I'm going to put a lot of this is going under the realm of the U.S. no longer defending the Western world. There are benefits to that and there's detriments to that. But here's some of the things that have come out of it. Lithuania has withdrawn from the International Convention banning cluster munitions. It is the first European Union country to withdraw from a multilateral arms control agreement. They have also announced its intention to withdraw from another international treaty banning the use of anti-personnel mines. These are things that were put in place because the U.S. said it was a good idea to get rid of these weapons that are indiscriminate in their killing. Now people are pulling out of those treaties. See, I got a bunch of things, so it's all scattered together here, so bear with me for a few moments. A tram driver in Prague attacked Ukrainians with a small child and kicked them out of the vehicle, saying that they were soiling the tram. It's a pretty intense interaction, we'll just put it that way. Over in Romania, the Russian-backed presidential candidate that was found with millions of dollars, weapons, Russian information, etc. That Romanian presidential candidate was arrested. There was a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into all that. This is Romania. I'm not as deep into that. But it doesn't look good from the U.S. perspective because all they're going to see is they're arresting politicians over there in Romania. Arresting's better than throwing out a window, though. I'm just going to state. So there's a lot of this thing that they're just likely to say that's totalitarian stuff. Now we'll talk about Turkey for just a moment here. Hey, Robbie, glad to see you. Always glad to have you on board. From Zineb Rabua, she says, I am optimistic about Ukraine's future, even if no one I know personally or anyone I've spoken to shares my view. I don't believe Turkey will allow a Russian-dominated Ukraine to become a reality, and the rise of Ukrainian nationalism is a great thing. Moscow might try, but it won't succeed. As for the Americans, they're not looking for victory or defeat, they just want quiet. Now, this comes from Erdogan basically making some rumblings that he was not going to allow Russia to carry out their plans in Ukraine. And Erdogan's been making some pretty big checks against Russia lately. It's an interesting thing. And Erdogan wants to become a regional power greater than what he is right now. He's already managed to deal with the situation in Syria, whether you think it's taken care of or not. But can he get Russia to back off? Is that even his intention? He made some pretty interesting noises, and it's something to keep an eye on. Robbie, you are absolutely right. If you use cluster munitions responsibly, they are super. We're seeing them effective in Ukraine. It's just people are seeing the need for themselves to have them now is what it comes down to. Over in Britain, sorry, had to remember what I was doing again. One of the S&P leaders stated that the House is united in supporting Ukraine, except for, quote, a few of Putin's poodles in reform, but he cannot support the populist playbook of cutting foreign aid. So a lot of things going on even in Britain about the Ukraine situation, the war in Ukraine, and the Americans changing their stance. Starmer has even gone so far as to start suggesting that they're going to seriously put boots on the ground in Ukraine. He states that this is a decision that's been 3 years in the making, after being called out, stating that you wouldn't see this if Donald Trump hadn't made his announcements. Starmer's been an interesting character. I've waffled back and forth on him for a bit, for the last little bit. There are many things I don't agree with him on. But when he made this statement, he then later kind of backed it off by saying that would only happen with U.S. support or backing. I don't know what he's thinking. He's a politician. Incoming German Chancellor Merz declared that Ukraine must defeat Russia, and they've established a 200 billion euro emergency defense fund, which is 4 times its current military budget. Now, he believes that the U.S. will flood Ukraine with weapons when Europe proves its commitment to military victory. So we'll see if that's a good prediction or not. The defeat of Ukraine would be the defeat of Europe. The Baltic states, Georgia, and Moldova are already on the list. Putin's goal is to return to Yalta, where half the continent was ceded to Stalin, according to French Senator Claude Mahuret. Got too many languages today. So after all the talk about Russia being willing to come to the negotiating table and the peace plan, since last Friday, the war in Ukraine has not subsided. There is no sign of Putin declaring his readiness for peace, at least through Donald Trump. There are no signs of that on Ukrainian soil or in Ukrainian skies, according to Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius. Norway more than doubled the aid planned for Ukraine in 2025, going to 85 billion Norwegian kroner from 35 billion. We are increasing support because there is a need for it. French President Macron is standing up. The question is he going to sit back down or not? We don't know. But Macron is standing up and saying the future of Europe is not going to be decided by Russia or by Washington. He emphasized that Europe needs to be able to defend itself and increase military spending, reindustrialize Europe, and transform according to the new global context. And by new global context, he means one in which they cannot rely on the U.S. to defend them. In that same context, I think I've got this in here somewhere, but I might not, so I'm going to mention it now. France is talking about extending their own their own nuclear deterrent as an umbrella over all of Europe. In other words, they're rebuilding their nuclear arms capability. And they're going to potentially offer that to the rest of Europe as a way to counter Russia's nukes. All of these are good calls anyway, regardless of what the U.S. does. Europe needs to reindustrialize and be able to produce their own weapons and hardware and be able to defend themselves, regardless of what the U.S. does. Romanian authorities detained 6 individuals connected with Russia on treason charges, including a 101-year-old former general who had plans to undermine Romania's sovereignty and stage a coup d'etat. Interesting. I would love to see the evidence. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm willing to take it a little bit on faith, and I've seen this from multiple sources. I would love to see the evidence, though. From Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, Europe must win this race. I am convinced that Russia will lose this race, just as the Soviet Union lost a similar race 40 years ago. This is the only way to avoid a larger scale conflict. And that comes back to appeasement. Appeasement doesn't work. And that's what they're stating now. Information appeared that a meeting between the U.S. and Ukrainian delegations will take place next Tuesday in Saudi Arabia with no official confirmation. Again, I've seen this from multiple sources. We'll see. We'll see if it actually happens or not. The European Union is ready to create a coalition of the willing, familiar term there, to ensure one country cannot block support for Ukraine, basically taking the support for Ukraine outside of the EU government framework so that Hungary can't block it. Spy agencies around the world may limit their information sharing with the United States due to its reconciliatory approach to Russia. And this includes some of the members of the Five Eyes, the alliance that shares intelligence information. US, UK, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. then adding in that may also include Israel and Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of concerns that it looks like sensitive information may end up in Moscow's hands rather than being held as sensitive. And that's the concern they're expressing here. And with the U.S. cutting off Ukraine, again, it shows that there is a real challenge to the sovereignty of these nations relying on the U.S. as an unreliable partner. There is talks of potentially deploying 120 combat aircraft as a sky shield over western Ukraine to ease the pressure on air defenses, basically allowing Ukraine to move more of its air defenses towards the front, whereas the European Union would be able to handle air defense over the heavily populated western part of Ukraine. Do I see it happening? I'm not convinced. But it is something that is kind of being floated in the air alongside Italy's proposal to apply NATO's Article 5 protections to Ukraine, despite it not being a member of NATO. Interesting to see. So, we'll see if anything comes of that. The European leaders did do a big meeting in Brussels where they agreed to bolster European defenses with an additional 800 billion euros. This is big. This is enormous. If the European Union starts investing that kind of money on a regular basis, they'll be rivaling the U.S. military budget. They just have a lot farther to come to get to that same level. For example, the British, I've heard this from Brits, that the British Navy is in pretty bad shape. That their military capabilities are pretty well shot at this point. Not enough tanks, not enough ships, etc. I'm not going to hang my hat on that because the Brits are amazing. We'll have to see what they do with this type of moving forward here. Still, the EU doesn't necessarily include Britain in this regard. Britain might need to step up its own spending even more. There was a rumor that temporary protected status for Ukrainian refugees in the U.S. was going to be canceled. The White House has now denied that, but they prevaricated by stating that no such decision has been made at this time. So for those with relatives or friends who are Ukrainian, who are here in the U.S. under that temporary protected status, hold your breath, cross your fingers, contact your elected officials. You'll probably want to express your concerns about that potential move. But again, they state right now that no such change has been made. Now, this is where the U.S. losing global influence starts to really hit the road here. Ukraine and China have signed an agreement to expand the list of Ukrainian agricultural exports to China, according to the Ministry of Agrarian Policy. Beijing also expressed readiness to cooperate with the international community for a constructive resolution of the crisis and achieve lasting peace. China is stepping up where the U.S. is stepping back. And much like their Belt and Roads Initiative, the one problem with anything promised by China is that it comes with enormous strings attached. So, we'll see. We'll see. There's a lot of... this is one of the many signs that the U.S. is no longer the top dog in the world in many ways. Or at least working on becoming not the top dog anymore. The actions of the U.S. president are a wake-up call for us to unite and create our own center of gravity, according to the Turkish foreign minister. Turkey wants to be part of any new European security architecture if NATO collapses. There's actually talk of creating a new NATO that excludes the United States. Interesting to see. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know if this will even happen. A lot will depend on what happens over the next few years. We'll see. However, the U.S. State Department is closing a number of American consulates in Europe, according to Reuters. Now, I haven't looked into this in depth, but it seems like the timing is interesting, and I will leave it at that. While Ukraine is arranging more grain exports to China, U.S. is imposing port fees on China-linked ships, according to Reuters again. This is part of the ongoing trade war that we've talked about several times so far. We'll see. France is getting serious about their own intelligence capabilities again. They've launched their third intelligence satellite into orbit today. This is they've got one of the better networks of military intelligence. I mentioned earlier the 800 billion euro emergency rearming program. All 27 heads of state in the European Union unanimously voted today for the Rearm Europe emergency funding program. This is money they're going to be spending to get their industry back together, their armaments manufacturing back together. Europe is standing up. Now, from President Trump, Ukraine will make a deal because they don't have a choice. But from Igor Sushko, the U.S. has now played all its cards by terminating all support for Ukraine, but the gambit failed. Europe will now mobilize at lightning speed and help Ukraine defeat Russia without U.S. involvement. Interesting. We'll see. We'll see. I mentioned this earlier, and so I'm going to touch on this real fast. The list of NATO member country casualties in Afghanistan after Article 5 was invoked following the 9/11 attacks. And I will let this list sit on the screen for just a moment here. The one time Article 5 was invoked was by the U.S. Defense contractors, cars, and now even the space industry. Due to the uncertainty and erratic behavior of the Trump administration, European stocks in the space industry, such as Eutelsat, are skyrocketing up by 500%. There seems to be a consensus among European nations that no U.S. service can be trusted anymore, including Starlink. The French Eutelsat has merged with the British OneWeb in 2023, and despite not having yet the same number of satellites as Starlink in orbit, offers already services to the Ukrainian military. Europe is divesting itself of the U.S. And some people will say, good, it's about time. And others will say, the U.S. will no longer have that influence. We'll see. Both can be true. It is not only the U.S. defense companies looking into the economic abyss. Tesla sales in Europe and China are collapsing. In January, Tesla sales plunged 60%, despite battery electric vehicle sales in Germany surging. This bad value dropped even more in February to 76%. This unprecedented turn of events in the battery electric vehicle market breathes new life into Volkswagen, which is dominating the German market. Of all most sold BEV cars, 7 out of 10 belong to VW or its other brands. On the other end of the scale, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Russia is spreading proposals on sanctions relief. The recommendations focus on lifting restrictions on the aviation and banking industries, investments, and luxury goods shipments. So this, to me, is no surprise. Not after everything I mentioned earlier. And the mixed messaging from the U.S. government realm here, while Trump has been saying, you can't go anywhere without us, that there's no other game in town, we have all the cards. His defense secretary is hailing the UK for stepping up as European leader on Ukraine amid shifting U.S. foreign policy. During a meeting with his counterpart, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth hailed the United Kingdom for stepping up and taking a lead among European allies to support Ukraine. Mixed messaging, very much mixed messaging from the U.S. administration. So let's move to the front lines. We've got some interesting things going on here. Ukrainians on the ground are seeing something interesting here, and I'm going to quote this specifically because of the way it's phrased. From J.P. Lindsley, who had a conversation with men on the ground. And this is very clear from the ground here in Ukraine. Ukrainians have been kicking ass at the front these past weeks. That story is obscured as panicked Russia works to obscure the reality and make a deal. Unfortunately, Ukraine's public voices are not helping the matter because they're not talking loudly about Ukraine's successes. Focus on that. It's a story that shows America that Ukraine is indeed a winning partner. The note here is from a former Ukrainian ambassador. The crazy thing is, this all started happening when Russia wore out and we started kicking their ass again. This is a common pattern. When Ukraine starts making some serious progress, all of a sudden something goes wrong with the U.S. relationship. It's pretty consistent. All right, so let's talk about the things that are going on. The worst news for Ukraine at this point is over here in Kursk near Sudza. Let's get this kind of watch what's going on here. You can see the Russians are managing to cut a portion of the line here and isolate this pocket. Now it's isolated up against Ukraine, so it's not like the Ukrainians can't move around. But this does put some serious pressure on the supply lines to Sudza, and there's indications that Ukraine may pull out of other portions of Kursk to start basically backing this off until they can regain territory here. I don't know where that's going to lead, just stating what I'm understanding from other sources. All right, so that's the bad news. The good news actually is over here. You can see here that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back near Zapadne here. Let me just back that up again so you can sort of see it. This, I'm going to call it a stand of trees, forested area. The Ukrainians retook it and managed to move forward. Well, Robbie, that's the only time you're going to hear it. It's pretty funny, I'm sure. The other place that the Ukrainians managed to make some progress here was near Sinkivka. Let me see if I can back it up far enough to find it. There it is. This is from about a week ago. The Ukrainians rolled back Russian gains near Sinkivka here in two places, both those spots. Let me see. I don't remember any changes near Kruhalivka here. Let me just back this up a few steps. Yeah, nothing there. No major changes in any of these areas. Was there something near Zarichne here? Looks like Ukraine just regained control of some of this area north of Kolodiazi. There we go. Let me see, nothing there. I know that for sure. Chasov Yar has pretty much gotten really no real changes in. Hang on, wow, I'm still going back. Chasov Yar was a major thrust by Russia for a while back. And as you can see, there's been no changes to the lines in weeks. Toretsk, on the other hand, is very interesting. Let me back this up a few days here. Oops. Oh, I'm not seeing it right now. The Ukrainians, I've got this from other sources, though. So the Ukrainians have managed to push the Russians back in Toretsk here. It's an interesting situation. A lot of stuff going on. It's not like they're recapturing some of the little villages around the area. That's not like, oh, a massive advance here. But the Russians have lost the initiative in Toretsk. So that's a good bit of news for Ukraine there. The other area where things are a mixed bag is near Pokrovsk, where, again, the Ukrainians have managed to reverse Russian gains with a few exceptions. Let me back up to there. Now, the only spot that's really things have rolled back even a little bit more is Pishene, where the Ukraine had an extent down to here. That has been rolled back a little bit by Russia. But all of these gains are, like in this area near Uspanivka, have been recent gains that Ukraine has managed to roll back. So Ukraine is effectively fighting them back and stopping the situation in Pokrovsk, which was one of the worst areas of the front not too long ago. Good to see this happening. Was there something near Velika Novosilka here? For some reason, I think there was. Let me just back it up real fast. Okay, there we go. Over here near Pravilne. Apologize to your family for me, Robbie, because these are awful pronunciations here. You can see the Russians did manage to take a little bit more territory here, basically closing up an area that they probably already controlled. My recollection is this was actually done several weeks ago, but the map was catching up. And that's the map changes. Ukraine has managed to stop Russia and begin rolling back some of their gains. So that's pretty good news. There's some bad news. There's some good news. It's war. It's a mixed bag. An interesting little story here. Ukrainian soldiers of the 225th Assault Regiment dropped 2 beehives into a basement full of Russian forces near Pokrovsk after running out of grenades. Interesting, unique tactic. I don't think I would have ever thought to grab a beehive and toss it down there to make the Russians uncomfortable in their little hole. But interesting tactic, making use of the resources they have available. Once the U.S. stopped their information sharing, the Russians launched a massive missile attack, and there was a hit on a facility in Kryvyi Rih that did a lot of damage. There was 5 killed at least, and many others injured. It was a bad situation. This was a hotel in Kryvyi Rih that was struck. Of course, Russia says, "Oh, it was full of foreign mercenaries." And the Ukrainians say there was a bunch of aid workers in the hotel. Take your pick on who you believe. The Ukrainians responded in kind with an attack on the Belbek airfield in Russian-occupied Crimea. The video is fuzzed out. I didn't want to go and chase the original version for this, but lots of explodey things happening in Crimea as well. Russia did gather together about 20 units of mechanized equipment and threw them into a push at Chasiv Yar. You'll note that I've already shown the map of Chasiv Yar, and there's been no change to the lines there. 16 of the 20 or so vehicles were destroyed outright, destroyed or damaged, and the assault was repelled outright. It was a tremendous Ukrainian victory for this area. I don't know where Russia found 20 units of armored vehicles to even pull off this attack. Nobody's given me a list of what vehicles were in it. But that's what it is. The missile strike on Ukraine, this is the routes the missiles were generally taking. It was mostly aimed at Ukraine's gas and energy infrastructure. Once again, the things that Russia has claimed that they do not target. Ukrainian forces are retaking more and more villages around Pokrovsk, with Russian channels reporting problems in manpower and Russian glide bombs being jammed. The glide bombs are an interesting case. The KAB glide bombs are able to be dropped well outside of the normal range of normal air defenses that are near the front lines. And the Ukrainians have, for a long time, have been complaining about how accurate these KAB glide bombs are. They've been not necessarily pinpoint accurate, but certainly combat accurate to anything on the front lines. Recently, though, Ukraine has managed to come up with ways to jam the guidance systems on those bombs, throwing them off and throwing their guidance far off. Where it was before, usually about 1 in 2 bombs would hit their target. Now it's 1 in 16. Interesting. So there are reports around Pokrovsk of those Russian glide bombs being jammed. There's also reports from Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, and Kupiansk, where Ukrainian forces are gradually pushing back Russian troops. This is a report from just yesterday. And it does seem to be a more general development. The Ukrainians are motivated right now. I don't know if the whole thing in the U.S. got to the front lines and they said, "Screw this, we're gonna kick some butt," or if Russia finally ran out of steam, and that's the reason why they're trying to, we're going to talk. I don't know why, but it's interesting to see. From the Russians, War Gonzo source, generally fairly accurate, but from the Russian perspective, Zaporizhzhia front, increased combat, but too early to talk about successes. Donetsk, Russian troops are continuing to storm. I don't know what they mean by Constantinople, but you know that area there better. With fighting taking in the Rosliv area, with Ukrainians counterattacking. Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack at every opportunity, quote, sometimes successfully, which is huge for having this source say that. So it's probably more successful than he's trying to imply. Chasiv Yar, no changes. Kursk, with the Russians putting troops on the Russian troops putting pressure on Ukraine in several areas with stable advances. The situation in Kursk may, in fact, be falling apart. It depends on what sort resources Ukraine is willing to invest in holding that salient. And we'll have to see how that pays out in the next few days. Russia threw a significant amount of resources to try to retake that, and it appears to be finally paying off. But note that Ukraine is making advances in other areas. We'll have to watch and see. Ukrainian forces advanced at Shevchenko. This is from 2 days ago in a mechanized assault. Tourette's gray zone expanded as Ukrainian forces are sighted, etc. We're seeing a lot of good news for Ukraine in these last few days here. French Mirage 2000s were now in the skies, engaging Russian drones and cruise missiles. So they're now using those French fighters to also help with their air defense. And here's a little bit more detail on the situation near Sudza with Russians having broken through. I already mentioned that line earlier. So this is the territory where our units are trying to hold back the enemy to avoid the threat of partial or complete encirclement. So we'll be watching the Kursk region in the next couple of videos. Ukrainian forces withdrew further from the north of the Kursk salient as their supplies threatened. Again, this just indicates that Russia's throwing a lot more resources at the area right now. It may have accomplished its purpose, as in to get it through the initial start of the Trump administration. And we'll see. We'll see. From the Ministry of Defense of the UK, Russia has likely sustained approximately 90,000 casualties in the Russia-Ukraine conflict so far in 2025. Since invading Ukraine, Russia has likely sustained approximately 875,000 casualties in total. The average daily Russian casualties during February 2025 was 1,255. Which is the lowest daily average since August 2024. This is likely because Russians are finally at the end of their primary offensives. They've expended a lot of their strength to do this. So the odds are that number is going to drop as they go from outright assaults to a more defensive posture. That said, I have seen word that the Russian high command or high Russian leadership is offering bonuses to officers if they'll capture territory. So there's been a lot of just unsupported meat assaults. So overall, I just kind of want to quickly show these maps from the Institute for the Study of War. And they talk about both the Ukrainian and Russian forces recently advancing in Pokrovsk. This is a big change. There's been a lot of talk about Russian gradual advances. Well, that's stopped by and large. We'll have to see if the Ukrainians can roll them back even farther. All of this is to say, it's crazy things going on in Ukraine. And that's really kind of everything that's going on. I've got a couple of extras here. I just want to say, it's a challenging time. And there's so much evil in this world. Keep the faith. It's going to be really hard. But don't let the disinformation and the propaganda get to you. Don't let Satan get to you. And to finish off, we're going to just do a couple of quick little cute animal-related items. From the defense of Ukraine, furry friends are true friends to our warriors on the front lines. And that's one grumpy-looking cat sitting on the radiator of a Humvee there. And we'll end off with this lost dog in the destroyed town in the Zaporizhia direction, who is happy, you can see him running from the back there, to find a Ukrainian fighter at last. Comes running out and immediately settles down for some pets and some attention from a fighter here. As always, I am impressed with the love and attention the Ukrainians spend on the animals. It shows where their hearts truly lie. And that's everything for today. Thank you for joining me, Robbie, Lucille, Jerry. Always glad to have you on board. Thank you for commenting. I do appreciate it. I'm glad I was able to read it this time. That's a nice change of pace. I appreciate every single one of you. You guys have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next video.